Okay, let's get started. So, this is part two of our discussion of current events. I think you all know the events that we're referring to. Unfortunately, we used a certain term in the title of the last attempt at streaming today, and as a result, the stream was blocked. So, actually, I don't know that that's the reason why. The stream got blocked,
It
and there
seems
was a name.
likely.
So, putting two and two together. Would you
Yeah.
like to lead us
I,
out?
I, I, sure. I like to think all of our viewers are smart enough to figure out what we're talking about here. So we're back off of what a 2 or 3 week hiatus since last talked about current events, the coronavirus, quarantine measures, social isolation, so on and so forth, all of that stuff. So that I think is what we're going to talk about today. Um, for I guess probably about 45 minutes to 60 minutes. There's one thing that I actually would like to kick this off with. I've written out a few things that I'm hoping we'll touch on, and I'm sure you have some things you want to touch on too, Joseph. But one of the things that's really struck me as the last 3 to 4 weeks have occurred, as all these events have transpired, is how simultaneously unpredictable this whole situation is. I saw a picture going around on social media from a biology textbook back in 2010, right, talking about these coronaviruses and the potential risks that they could cause. And they even mentioned, wet markets in China and so forth, right? And so on the one hand, it's like, this isn't the first time that a communicable disease has leveled civilizations, right? I mean, it's not even the first time in the last 100 or 200 years that a virus has caused, or that some kind of disease has caused major problems for civilizations and societies, right? I mean, like, in theory, you should be able to see this coming, right?
Or at least
And
recognize that it's the type of thing that can happen,
yes,
and the
yeah,
type of thing that one should be prepared for because it's always lurking in the background. Never know exactly
yeah.
when it's going to happen, but it's the type of thing that can happen.
And so on the one hand, you almost want to accuse, everybody of this gross malfeasance, like, oh, we should have known this was coming, right? And we clearly did not, right? I mean, in January, if somebody had said that this was going to happen, something like 97% of us would have said, well, you're crazy, right? Um,
Or
nobody saw this coming in January. Nobody saw this coming in February, at
paranoid or
least,
whatever.
or paranoid, yeah, something like that,
Yeah.
right? But then on the other hand, playing devil's advocate to sort of the thing that I've said there, it's also true that, um, we're always balancing all kinds of risks,
Sure.
right?
And a lot of them are
Ranging,
not forefront in our minds at any given time. Like, how worried are
yeah,
you today that your car's going to break down? Which is, I know, something
exactly.
that you've been working on recently.
Yeah, well, and there's the thing is, like, well, why weren't we worried about the coronavirus? Well, I don't know, maybe partially because we were worried about lots of other things, and there's plenty of things to be worried about, right? And so it just strikes me as interesting how simultaneously predictable and unpredictable this all has been. And I mean, I guess I think the lesson from that is, you know, uh, back to our, continual theme about preparing for risks, right? And being more safe than you think you need to be, right?
Our
Um,
downside is capped, dare we say it?
yeah,
Oh, so I need to
yeah,
let everybody in on the joke that is
sure,
in that statement. So
sure.
when we went on our trip through Europe to film, there's a whole bunch of videos over the last year that we've released that were filmed in a 3 week span in May of last year, where we just filmed like crazy in the Netherlands and in the UK. And during that time, I made a joke out of saying, well, at least our downside is capped several times. And at first, I meant it. Like, well, it can't get any worse. I mean, we missed a
Yeah,
flight, and we're like, well, it can't get any worse than that. And then things kept happening, and so finally, whenever I would say our downside is capped, like you would be very upset at me for saying such things.
yeah,
So that was pretty funny,
yeah.
and
I
ever
mean,
since then, it's become a joke.
yeah. Well, I mean, like, imagine right now we make contact with an extraterrestrial species and they invade the planet right now, right? Like, knock on
Sure,
wood, man, knock on wood, right?
sure.
Uh,
Or
no
certain
matter,
segments of the economy collapse, or we find out
sure.
that I don't know, some major device needs to get recalled or whatever.
Yeah, there. I mean, there's just a whole host of
Or
additional
a toilet
complications that
paper
could happen. Our
factory
downside is
catches
not.
fire because of the over demand led them to use unsafe practices, and suddenly the whole supply is gone.
Although I feel like with the recent video on Roman toilet paper, our actually might be somewhat capped in that regard.
For sure. For sure.
So that's one thing I think about. Another thing I think about is that's related to it, is that you would think that what I'm struck by is over the last few weeks, how hard it has been to get a picture of what's going on. You know, one thing you might think about these black swan events is that they happen, and then, you know, it's unexpected, but at least you can adapt to it. And something that has, I mean, I think that we're all learning individually and collectively right now is that we have no idea how to adapt to this because we have no idea exactly what it is that's going on. And I'm kind of overstating the case. Obviously, there's lots of things we do know, right? But you know, we're in this continual process of discovery where we're like, okay, well, you know, maybe we do need to do a massive lockdown. Maybe we should instead do a herd immunity approach. You know, maybe this thing, you know, it turns out maybe the coronavirus has been circling through the world since last November, and so maybe, you know, 30% of the population or whatever number have already contracted coronavirus and gotten over it, or else become non-symptomatic transmitters of the disease, right? You know, we've learned new things about the transmission and had what we thought we knew about transmission methods, what we thought we knew has been modified or overturned. You know, we're learning all kinds of things about mortality rates, and that also means unlearning what we thought we knew a week ago or 3 days ago, right? And so one of the things that really strikes me about this is how opaque and how uncertain everything is, even as it develops and even as we're learning. Like, we're learning things, and we have to trust what it is that we're learning. But we know that in a week we're going to know things that make what we know today obsolete.
So there's two things to unpack.
And so there's uncertainty built into this all the way through. Yeah, go ahead.
So there's two things. One of them is a point about headlines and about news in general. It is an interesting thing that the more news you watch, the less useful it becomes. Nassim Taleb talks about toxicity of headlines in a nutshell. And basically, if you pay really close attention to the news that you consume, pay attention to what proportion of that news is actually speculation. If you watch the sports channel, how much of what you are watching as news or analysis is really speculating about the future? The best way to find out what's in the future is to wait for it. Unfortunately, we are really, really, really bad at predicting. And there are some things where we have to predict, like when you're making a budget, for instance. You need to kind of foresee what the general parameters of the future are going to look like. But you should be in the business of predicting the future as little as possible. And one of the consequences that this has on news is that if you filter out the highlights of the news by minute, most of what you're going to get is garbage. If you filter it out by hour, the proportion of garbage goes down just a little bit because we know a little bit more. Expand that out to day or week or month. As soon as you get to about a year, pay attention to only the most relevant things from this year after the year is done. At that point, we have the benefit of hindsight. Most of the things that we were speculating about for more than half the year have happened. So you can actually trust the news at that point. So the farther you space out your news consumption, the more you can trust, roughly speaking, what is important. And your intuitions about what is relevant and what is not will be better, because the proportion of stuff that is speculation will be lower. The second thing is, whenever you're making plans that involve the future, and unfortunately, dealing with a pandemic is one of those things where you have to predict the future. You have to at least pretend. You have to try, because you're dealing with consequences that haven't materialized yet, and you're trying to prevent bad stuff from happening. And so, an abundance of caution actually makes a lot of sense. The best information that we have at the time is what we use to make decisions at the time. And as we adjust, we don't look back and say, well, we were so dumb for doing that. We say, no, we made that with the best information available, and now we're going to reassess. And so there's some really interesting stuff about the future. Basically, it's opaque. Be careful how much news you consume, because more than half of it's just guesswork about the future, which is more than worthless, because it can convince you erroneously that you actually do know what's going to happen, which is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more. And I think, you know, my biggest struggle with Nassim Taleb's perspective on the news, right, this idea that, you know, if you pay attention to the news on a daily basis, then most of the news is going to be noise instead of signal. And proportionately, the longer you wait to read the news, the higher the proportion of signal to noise there will be, right? The more real stuff there will be there, the less
The trouble
the
with
less
that is that
incorrect speculative
there's
fluff.
reasons for the noise. Like, one of the reasons why we
Well,
fill the news with noise is because we have to make decisions that involve the future.
I
And
was going to
so,
say this is exactly
yeah,
where I was going to go. Is that to me the big problem with Nassim? And I mean I think Nassim Taleb is exactly correct, right? But the other side of this is that I can't wait, and no one can wait until the end of the year to figure out how to respond to current events, right? You actually do need to make decisions as you go. There's this quote that I love from Giambattista Vico. Giambattista Vico was one of the thinkers in the late Renaissance, early Enlightenment, during this time period where the hard sciences are really coming into their own and becoming incredibly, incredibly powerful. And he was trying to find a way to he was trying to answer the question of whether the hard sciences really could answer all our problems or whether we needed the humanities as well, is a fair way of characterizing his work, I think. Anyway, so he said, the problem with the scientists and the philosophers is that if you ask them a problem, they'll say, give me a while to think it over. And he says, but, that doesn't help when you need to make a decision now. And the specific example that he raises is court cases that are going to be settled today. And you can't make that decision based upon the certainties that philosophy and science are going to yield. Instead, you need to base it upon the probabilities that are accessible within a short time frame, right? I mean, and this comes up with things like, hydroxychloroquine or whatever, right? Where we actually cannot run the studies on it to figure out if it's any good, right? We cannot run the kind of rigorous scientific studies that we would like to. We have to make decisions based on the information that we have now, with full knowledge that those decisions may appear ill-informed, a week or a month or 5 years in the future, right? But we're still burdened with the necessity of acting today, and that poses real difficulties because you want certainty, but you can't get certainty today in most cases. You have to act on probabilities, and I think that goes exactly back to where you ended up as well, which is it pays to be extra cautious, right? It pays to be extra cautious and to hedge yourself against unfortunate future occurrences.
there is a way of dealing with the future that I call the even if principle.
Mm-hmm.
To the greatest degree possible, I want to make the news irrelevant to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way I want to resolve this, because if I know that most of the news I'm consuming is garbage, is noise rather than signal, then
Mm-hmm.
it would be really, really nice if I didn't have to, or at least to the lowest degree possible, didn't had to. Sorry, I lost control of that sentence. I would like to not have to make decisions now based off of incomplete information when I can avoid it. So
Mm-hmm.
what that means is don't wait to hoard, if that makes sense. During the good times, set aside 3 months of food storage, 6 months. If you're really, really concerned about the end of the world, maybe a year's worth or more.
Mm-hmm.
My wife and I, just barely before the coronavirus became mainstream news, I follow a news channel called China Uncensored, which I highly recommend. And I was hearing reports about what's going on over there, and I thought, well, our food storage is running low, so my wife and I decided to stock up. And I've been trying to learn how to live on stored up wheat, like whole grain wheat. I've been learning how to make sourdough bread and kind of using the quarantine time to boost my baking ability, which has been fun. Definitely videos coming on that in the future. So having some food storage is really handy. In the past, my wife and I have used our food storage for a couple of other minor hiccups. When we had a couple of extra bills and didn't know how to take care of them, it was nice to not have to go grocery shopping for a couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
A couple times we've been in between jobs. I mean, it's a handy thing to put yourself in a position where you can say, well, even if we get quarantined, we're fine.
Mm-hmm.
As far as making decisions in the moment, though, it is sometimes absolutely necessary. I don't think it's always avoidable. And the law is a really good example of that. So it's interesting that we rely on the best information we had to hand at the time. Another example of this that I'd like to throw in there is terminally ill patients. The FDA and other drug testing organizations around the world, want to be very, very careful because when you put drugs into your body, they can kill you.
Mm-hmm.
But if the consequences of testing this drug are that you're going to die anyway in a couple months, then why not roll the dice, right? Does that seems to change the risk calculus a lot if in a way your downside is capped. It's not like you were going to survive to ripe old age anyway if you're terminal and you want to
Yeah.
try an experimental medication or treatment. So why not?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and this is, yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And this is kind of the conclusion that Giambattista Vico comes to, is he thinks that this is kind of a rough characterization, but he thinks that the humanities and particularly rhetoric are well adapted for dealing in situations. Um, let's see, how would you say it? For situations where you want to deal in probabilities, and that science and philosophy are very well adapted for dealing in situations where you want and you can obtain certainty, right? So, for example, to take those terminally ill patients, right? If you are a terminally ill patient and you're going to try some kind of speculative or uncertain remedy, maybe your odds are not good, right? I mean, who even knows what your odds are, right? We don't have anything like certainty here, right? But it actually pays in that kind of situation to think about probabilities. And that means, weighing your potential upside and your potential downside. And yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think that terminally ill patients fundamentally ought to be able to, broadly speaking, try what they want to try, precisely because their downside is capped, and precisely because in this situation, certainty is just not a necessary. It's not a necessary thing to have to make the decision, and maybe it's not even a desirable factor in the decisions because the certainty is too costly.
It's really interesting. One way of characterizing their position is to say that their downside is capped. Um, and I'm not necessarily going to disagree with that, but I want to show or play with a different way of characterizing that same scenario without using that terminology. So instead of saying the
Okay.
downside's capped, well, you're going to die anyway, so may as well try whatever. Um, I've been thinking hard about this kind of samurai philosophy. You were reading recently a book of samurai proverbs, and there seems to be this fundamental paradox that samurai philosophy is very much about give everything to try to win, all in,
Mm-hmm.
and also don't care if you'll ever die, which seem to contradict. And the way that I've been able to grapple through this, and this has become very influential in my personal philosophy over the last, I don't know, year or so, is this idea that the only fight worth getting in is one that's worth losing. So it isn't necessarily that your downside is capped so much as that you have accepted the possible downside that arises from your decision.
Hmm.
So the only fight that's worth getting in is one where even after you have lost, you can look back at that decision and say, yep, it's still worth doing. Which means, roughly speaking, the only reason to do it is for honor, kind of. One way of articulating that idea, because it was the right thing to do despite all the losses. And in the situation of a terminally ill patient, the downside cap thing is basically saying, well, I've already accepted the worst possible thing that can happen from testing this medication. I've accepted it. It's kind of implied in my situation. So at that point, it's worth trying.
Something like that the downside is accepted rather than that the downside is capped.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yes. And I think that applies to everything from martial arts in particular. It's a thorny problem. Like when is the appropriate time to fight? And I think the reason the appropriate time to fight is if and only if a loss is morally acceptable. I mean, you still try to win. You still give everything to try to win, like defending your life or your family. It is dishonorable to die without a fight. It is dishonorable to allow your family to die
There's
without a fight. But
there's a great quote.
yeah,
Who is it who wrote the Book of Five Rings? Miyamoto
Miyamoto
Musashi.
Musashi.
I think it's him. There's this phenomenal quote from him that he says it is dishonorable to die with a weapon yet undrawn, and
Yes.
that's his rationale. He was unusual. He was unusual. Let's see if I can remember this correctly. I believe he was unusual among samurai of his time in that he really liked fighting with both swords, the long sword and the short sword, at the same time, and that was his rationale for that. Was he said, "Look, it's I mean, what he said was, it's dishonorable to die with the long sword in your hands without having drawn your short sword, without having drawn every weapon available to you.
And the
Uh,
reason behind
so,
that,
I mean, that's that.
it's funny, this paradox gets dissolved. So on the one hand, you're like full commitment, all in, try to win. And on the other, don't care if you'll ever die. And this idea that you're committing to the level of the downside says that if you are going to commit to something to the level of I am willing to give my life for that, well, you'd better be willing to give your full effort too, right? It would be dishonest to enter into something without giving it everything.
Do you mind me talking about something that pivots towards economics?
Yes, please.
Okay, so because I've been thinking about this, right, and I'm like not even close to the smartest economist in the world, and I'm not even the smartest economist in my family. My brother is getting a PhD in finance from a pretty good university, so uh, I used to be the best person at economics in my family, and I got unthroned pretty fast. But it's something that I think about quite frequently, right? And so what I'm interested by is savings. I'm interested by this idea of putting aside 3 to 6 months or 12 months or what have you of food and toilet paper and what have you, right? And what makes that so interesting to me is that, like, as far as I can tell, it runs so counter to mainstream economic thought, because what mainstream economic thought would typically say is, well, hey, look, that's 3 to 12 months of unutilized resources that isn't circulating through the economy, right? And so from excuse me from like when I look at sort of mainstream economic thought, it says, hey, look, that's a terrible, terrible, terrible idea.
It's
And I
inefficient.
mean, that's the way we run public. Exactly.
It
Exactly.
doesn't
And that's
maximize
the way we run public.
utility.
Yeah, and this is the way that we run public finances too, right? Is that I mean, what kind of ludicrous idea is it that your country should run a surplus, right? That's just silly. Um, in fact, I'm not even sure. I'm kind of curious. I actually don't know this. How many developed countries do run a surplus? I don't. I mean, I know the United States doesn't, right? Our deficit, we have a deficit. We've run a deficit almost every year, and our debt is growing, right? And so we are firmly in the camp that no, like you can definitely run an economy based on debt. Like what kind of crazy idea is it to run an economy based on savings, right? And I mean,
Here's
most Americans, whether it's from
here's
a
the
person,
trouble
whether it's
with
from
debt,
necessity or
though.
real fast,
Sure.
I want to point out, most Americans also live their lives like this, whether it's from the necessity of their expenses to their paychecks, or whether it's from voluntary decisions in terms of lifestyle. That Americans do not have a whole lot of savings, broadly speaking, right? They are, in fact, quite fragile to shocks, whether that's the coronavirus or whether that's just losing your job. Anyway, yeah, go ahead.
So the thing that I dislike about debt, debt is an incredibly useful tool. The economists are right if you buy into the idea that you can predict the future. They're useful, but if you're going to put off paying for something into the future, you are making assumptions that you will be able to pay for that in the future, which you don't necessarily know. You don't know what your costs are going to be then. So everything involving debt involves projections of the future, which is inherently opaque and filled with nasty things that try to bite you, including coronaviruses. And so the idea that you would project into the future as a way of being puts so much faith in the future that or rather in your ability to predict the future,
Yeah.
because I can believe the future is going to be a good place, even if I don't know the details. And I need to know some of the details in order to go into debt now.
Well, actually, this
Slow down. Sorry, you're cutting out. Excuse me, we're having technical difficulties. Can you hear me? See, this is one of those things about the future we couldn't predict. Although it's the kind of thing that does tend to happen. I still can't hear you. Your image is frozen for a moment. Hmm. Gonna try to bring him back into the conversation. Let's see if it works. Just a moment. Aha!
Are we back?
I believe so. Did that fix it?
Yeah, I can hear you and I can see you, so
So
I
that was
think so.
ironic. We just had an example of a minor black swan.
Yeah. um, so the cult of data, right? This idea that we're just going to collect enough data and we're going to be able to understand all of it, and then we're going to be able to predict everything, and we're going to know everything. And I want to add parenthetically that like I've worked with data in the past. I've helped nonprofits and businesses use their data to make smarter decisions. So I'm not speaking to this as a total outsider, and I'm not totally skeptical of its value. But I am skeptical of, let's call it again, like the cult of, well, again, I want to call it the cult of data, which is not just the use of data. It's not just the use of machine learning, but it's the belief that sort of this is going to magically solve all of our problems. And there's a couple things wrong with this. And one thing is sort of, again, this assurance, right? The sense of assurance that we want to get from our models, right? And we've seen over the weeks how these models have changed, right? How the death toll and the infection rate will go up and they'll go down, right? And you look at that and you're like, okay, like I understand the need for models, but we should not be worshiping these things because they're just not that solid, right? And I know that the cultists of big data will respond, well, but we're just modifying the models, right? And today's model is better than yesterday's model. And to which my response is, well, yes, absolutely. But, you're saying that with the benefit of hindsight, and I don't have the benefit of hindsight today. I need to make decisions today.
Oh,
right?
Good point. Good point.
Right. And so, I don't appreciate, like, it doesn't do any good to say, I mean, I do think that we should have these models and develop them over time. But to me, it's an absolute cop-out to say, well, I understand that my model yesterday was a little bit off, but I've tweaked the assumptions and I've tweaked the linear, I've tweaked the line of fit, and now I've got the real model. And I'm like, okay, but what are you going to tell me tomorrow, right?
So there's a general idea that predictions should always come with their prior track records as an error bar. Cut out again. This is frustrating. I'll articulate the rest of the idea. So there's this idea that when you have bad models, you there? When you have bad models, or rather when, let's say the weatherman makes a prediction and says, we have a 75% chance of rain tomorrow. And then it either rains or it doesn't. And then you keep track over time for this weatherman how often he is right with the stats. And that's just being honest about how good the methods he's using are for predicting the weather. They're useful, they're better than nothing. But when you make a prediction, it should come with the error bar attached to it, which says this is the degree of confidence you can place in this prediction itself. Would be a more honest way to go about that. It's an interesting thing. I'm interested, since we've got a moment to ask this, how do you guys think about prediction? Is prediction something that is never justified, sometimes justified? How much faith should we place in data? There seems to be this very broad chasm between science denying, where we deny observed results, and the useful, amazing things we can do with empiricism, and then trusting it to a level that seems unhealthy. So how do you navigate that? Please leave your comments. That would be fascinating to see. Are you back?
Yeah, do we have any idea about what's making us cut out? Is this something we can fix, or are we just gonna muscle through?
I'm in the even if camp, so let's just keep going and see what happens. If there's an easy fix and we can tell what it is, then let's fix it, but I don't want to stress about it too much.
Let's live that samurai lifestyle. Let's live that samurai lifestyle.
Even if. That should be a t-shirt.
Yeah, and I am interested to see those comments in the chat, right? And again, like, I think we definitely should have the models.
Yes. Use them.
Right.
To the degree that they are useful.
What I'm concerned about is the degree of confidence that we place in them, basically. I think that's a pretty fair way of putting it, right? Um, if you see a model that predicts like a 70% likelihood of something, then I think what we interpret that is that's right.
It's giving us trouble again. Yeah, as far as using the models go, I don't disagree at all. I think we should use them. One thing that I would love to get your take on is, are there places, or show me the specific places or a couple of examples so that we can kind of work around this, where putting too much faith in a model causes more harm than if there was a little bit more skepticism, so that the relationship was, say, healthier. Okay. Oh, you're at. Lost you again. Okay. Well, this is fascinating. In other news, I recently moved during the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, which was an interesting experience. I'm used to having a lot of help when I move, from friends and neighbors and family, and also particularly from my church congregations. That is just a traditional part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is that we help everybody move. I've helped so many people move, it's not even funny. But it didn't seem ethical to ask for help to move when we're all kind of self-quarantining. So I bought a hand truck and loaded the moving truck by myself, with my wife steadying things occasionally. And we moved. It took 2 days to load the truck and 2 days to unload the truck, and it was absolutely crazy. Now we're in a more rural area, and that'll be nice for future videos, but a very, very interesting experience. I even had a couple of friends offer to help, and I was like, not now. Didn't seem to be appropriate, given how good we've been with the whole social isolation thing up to that point. So that's been an adventure on our end. It's the reason also for these cardboard boxes behind me, which hopefully will go onto the garden. Yeah. Waiting for the Zoom call to catch up. We'll see. Yeah, it seriously is stressful enough all on its own. Adding in the pandemic was hard. It was kind of funny. For me personally, thank you, by the way, for that, physics police. I appreciate that. On the kind of two things going on. So the move was more stressful in that there's a pandemic going on and I couldn't ask for help. However, where I moved to is extremely rural, and for me, that brought a tremendous amount of comfort. I'm in an area that produces more food than it uses, and that's really nice. If there's ever going to be a scarcity thing, then it's nice to be in the country. It is very resonant with this even if philosophy that I am very fond of. And so it's kind of funny. In World War II, in the countryside in, say, Great Britain, for instance, Great Britain imported a massive amount of their food before World War II, and so the prospect of a blockade using U-boats was absolutely disastrous. They were producing less than half of the food that they consumed. And so in order to be able to sustain your population through a war and basically not be laid siege to by a cutoff of shipping, you had to be really, really, really careful to ramp up food production. And so rationing became commonplace all over the country. It got progressively harder throughout the war, but one place where you could be sure that you would have a little bit extra is if you lived in the country. If you were directly related to farming, then you were all right. As far as in the garden goes, right now I'm growing a whole bunch of kale, and all the plants are currently inside. I love peas, so lots of peas, lots of kale. The only ones that have gone in the garden outside are the potatoes. Lots of tomatoes. I bought a whole bunch of seeds, so it's basically going to be everything if I can get it to grow. And corn. I have a very special relationship with Flint corn, the varieties that are native. So all the ones that are not sweet corn, which is kind of the weird F1 hybrid modern thing. Traditionally, it was called green corn because it's just unripe corn, but nowadays we use F1 hybrid, which is where you cross two lines that are inbred to get a very consistent result. And that is incredibly sweet because it doesn't convert the starches into sugars. I mean, it doesn't convert the sugars into starches. It maintains them as sugars for quite a lot longer. But the starchy ones are amazing. Amazing as a long-term food. They're delicious. They're super good for you, and I like tortillas, so that's something I'm hoping to grow. Let's see here. No update as far as Joseph F. coming back into the conversation. Hopefully that comes out in a moment or two. You know, it really is kind of ironic that an unexpected interruption happened in a discussion that is mostly focused on unexpected interruptions in daily life. Well, with that, I think we should probably close for the day. I appreciate all of you who have been watching live. Thank you so much for your time. And I appreciate your comments. Chaos Swiss Roll, predictions are undoubtedly useful and they're definitely better than intuition. I don't see a problem with blind trust in models provided the risk resulting from the model being wrong is reasonable. What do I think about that? Yeah, basically, I think it would have everything to do with whether or not the trust in the model itself created an additional risk. So I don't think you're wrong. If the downside for trusting in the downside from trusting in the model was very low, then why not throw all your trust into it? It's absolutely fine. Or if the alternatives are more risky, that could be another one. Lots of chard. Physics police commenting on garden. We've got lots of chard, big leaf mustard, and collard greens growing in a couple small boxes. Awesome! I've had good luck with chard. It grows well for me. The trouble is I don't enjoy eating it. So that is a problem. But good on you. To me, it tastes like caterpillars. Don't ask me how I know that. Stay safe out there. Awesome. I think we're going to wrap up there for today. It has been enjoyable reading your comments. Kevin Kenny, Poor Richard, 3 removes equal 1 fire. I'm not sure exactly what that one is. Poor Richard is how do you say that in English? The aphorisms made by Benjamin Franklin in his Poor Richard's Almanac, which was a very popular publication in the 1700s. Very witty, but I'm not sure I understand that particular one. Another key point, are the starting conditions close to the ones for which the model was established? Extrapolation is dangerous. It is incredibly dangerous. One of the troubles with data sets is that they only include things that have happened, not things that might happen or fundamentally haven't happened. So one example of this is a data set from your own wife. How many days have you died? None. So if your data set only includes experiences that you yourself have, then death is impossible because you can't project. Your data set does not include any instantiations of dying. So it's not something that's on your radar. One of the problems with a black swan is this moving 3 times equivalent damage to a house fire. Oh, yeah, I could see that. I could see that. Maybe more. I've actually moved 9 times in the last 8 years, moving around for college and such, for the undergraduate degree, and then I'm finishing up my JD in the next week or 2. Awesome. Yeah, it's really interesting. I want to be very precise about the bounds of my knowledge. There's a line from Confucius where he defines education by saying, to be educated is to know precisely what you do know and to know precisely what you do not know. And so my general relationship with science and data is useful, yes, incredibly powerful, yes, but it has limitations and some blind spots, and I want to be very, very precise about where those are so that I don't make predictions in areas where I can't, that are not justified by my data, if that makes sense. One example of this is metaphysics in general. Empiricism is really, really bad at touching metaphysics. It just is. And there are certain metaphysical questions, like, say, value theory, that are really hard to avoid because we need to live our lives and have arguments about what matters and what doesn't, and what we should do and what we shouldn't, and what is just and what is not just. And empiricism is absolutely terrible for answering those questions, because the best we can give with empiricism for those is an anthropological answer, and that really only explains what people do think, not what they should think, which is a totally different question. Okay, JF is participating in the comment section. That's awesome. Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. It's a really interesting thing. I hope that this shock, which is for many in my generation the biggest shock that we've experienced, kind of the millennial-ish generation, I'm hoping that this generally makes us more aware that shocks are a thing that can happen, to live, and prompts us to live in a more even-if manner, so that more of us keep some savings and store up some food and generally live in a manner that can survive shocks. And with that, I think we're going to conclude. Thank you again so much for watching. We really appreciate you, and we'll look forward to seeing you the next time.